Hello and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Ladi Akiri-Bulwale. The headlines. U.S. Secretary of the Treasury says the United States will not be at the G20 meeting if Russia attends. Russia begins sovereign bond payment of more than $600 million in rubles to holders. And a volunteer-led organization in Chicago organizes evacuations of 15,000 from Ukraine. We begin with the news that U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the United States will not participate in a number of meetings of the group of 20 largest global economies if Russia is a participant because of its invasion of Ukraine. She also says that the Russian ruble's near-complete recovery in recent weeks is not a signal that the Russian economy is weathering the sanctions Washington and its allies have imposed on Russia. The Russian economy, according to her, is reeling from the sanctions imposed after the late February invasion of Ukraine. Mrs. Yellen adds that the market for rubles has become so distorted by actions of the Russian government and its central bank to limit capital outflows that people should not infer anything from the value of the ruble, which fell to a record low against the US dollar immediately after the invasion, but has since retraced most of those losses.
So President Biden's made it clear, and I certainly agree with him, that it cannot be business as usual for Russia in any of the financial institutions. He's asked that Russia be removed from the G20, yes. And I've made clear to my colleagues in Indonesia that we will not be participating in a number of meetings if the Russians. We are working very closely with our partners to have a coordinated set of sanctions, and our goal from the outset has been to impose maximum pain on Russia, while, to the best of our ability, shielding the United States and our partners of undue economic harm.
Meanwhile, U.S. President Joe Biden himself has been railing against Russia, saying it is responsible for, quote, major war crimes, days after the grim discovery of civilians shot dead at close range in the Ukrainian town of Bucha, north of Kiev, when it was retaken from Russian forces. Mr. Biden accuses Russia of laying bare its, quote, brutality and humanity, adding that, quote, there's nothing less happening than major war crimes. His remarks came on the same day that the U.S. announced new sanctions.
And I'm sure you've seen the pictures from Bucha and just outside of Kyiv. Bodies left in streets as Russian troops withdrew. Some shot in the back of the head with their hands tied behind their backs. Civilians executed in cold blood, bodies dumped into mass graves, a sense of brutality and inhumanity left for all the world to see unapologetically. There's nothing less happening than major war crimes. Responsible nations have to come together to hold these perpetrators accountable. And together with our allies and our partners, we're going to keep raising the economic cost and ratchet up the pain for Putin and further increase Russia's economic isolation. Thanks to the bravery, the grit, and the fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people, Russia has already failed in its initial war aims. Russia wanted to take Ukraine's capital city, Kyiv, and topple its democracy and elected government. Today, Kyiv still stands, and that government still presides. This fight is far from over. Here's the point. This war can continue for a long time, but the United States will continue to stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in the fight for freedom. And I just want you to know that. And by the way, if I got to go to war, I'm going with you guys. I tell you. I mean it.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called on Western politicians to quickly agree on an embargo on Russian oil, complaining that their failure to do so was costing Ukrainians their lives. In an early morning video address, Mr. Zelensky also said he would continue to insist Russian banks be completely blocked from the international financial system. Russia's 6-week-long invasion of Ukraine has forced over 4 million people to flee, killed or injured thousands, and left cities and towns destroyed. Mr. Zelensky says Moscow was making so much money from oil exports that it did not need to take peace talks seriously, and called on the, quote, democratic world to shun Russian crude. Ukraine and Western governments reject Russia's claim that it wants to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine as a false pretext for its invasion. The United States recently targeted Russian banks and elites with a new round of sanctions. Mr. Zelensky, however, said the announcement was good, but not good enough. The Pentagon says it has assessed that Ukraine could win the war against Russia, even as U.S. officials speak of the risk of a protracted conflict. At a briefing, Admiral John Kirby also talked about shipments of new weapons systems to Ukraine, such as 100 Switchblade drones known as kamikaze drones and thousands of Javelin anti-tank systems. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman says that the range of sanctions imposed on Russia for its war in Ukraine should give China's leader Xi Jinping a, quote, good understanding of the consequences China could face if it provides material support to Russia. Mr. Sherman made the, Ms. Sherman made the remarks at a U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee hearing. The U.S. Treasury Secretary had also issued a warning to China that the Treasury was prepared to turn its sanctions tools against Beijing in the event of Chinese aggression against Taiwan, which China claims as a wayward province.
If China, in any way, shape, or form, provides material support to Putin in this premeditated, unjust, and unprovoked invasion, there will be consequences. I think one only has to look at the range of sanctions, more to be announced today, against Putin, against the economy, against individuals who are enablers, against elites, against oligarchs, export controls, designations, sanctions that are not only from the United States, but in unprecedented fashion, coordinated with our allies and partners, not just in Europe, but throughout the world. Gives President Xi, I think, a pretty good understanding of what might come his way should he, in fact, support Putin in any material fashion. This is a very serious matter that we take quite seriously.
Now, Russia's defense ministry says that a Ukrainian-fueled Sochit barge was destroyed by Russian missiles in the Kharkiv region. The Russian forces also destroyed some Ukrainian military equipment and foreign weapons at the railway station in the same region, and that's according to a foreign ministry spokesperson, Igor Konashev, in a statement earlier on today. Meanwhile, foreign ministers of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization member states have held a meeting in Brussels on stepping up military support for Ukraine. Speaking ahead of the ongoing two-day event, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said that some allies are already providing a significant amount of advanced heavy weapons for Ukraine, and he expects the foreign ministers will make more commitments on how NATO can further support Ukraine. Although the meeting once again calls on Russia and Ukraine to return to the negotiating table, handing more weapons to one of the parties involved in the conflict seems to be encouraging further confrontation. Vladimir Zabarov, first deputy chair of the Russian Federation Council Committee on Foreign Affairs, said that in an interview with reporters that NATO countries stepping up military support for Ukraine will only lead to escalation of the conflict, adding that what the NATO countries are doing now is fueling the conflict to further scale up. He said it is inevitable that the huge railway network will be used to transport weapons. Mr. Stoltenberg also said during the meeting that if Finland and Sweden apply for NATO membership, all allies will welcome them. He stressed that the two countries meet the NATO standards when it comes to interoperability and democratic control of the armed forces. The NATO foreign ministers are also joined by their counterparts from Asia-Pacific countries, including Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. The NATO side said stronger ties with Asia-Pacific partners are needed to jointly cope with global challenges. But analysts said it is worth attention and vigilance that the self-proclaimed defensive alliance is extending its tentacles to the Asia-Pacific region by deepening cooperation with some countries in the region under the pretext of maintaining security and stability amidst the Ukrainian crisis. Russia's defense ministry says that, Mexican President Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador says he will be unable to attend an event in support of Ukrainian victims of the conflict with Russia, but would send a video condemning Moscow's invasion. Earlier, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau had invited Mr. Obrador to the event. He is convening with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to raise funds for Ukrainian refugees and internally displaced people. The invitation came amidst criticism that Mexico has been too accommodating of Moscow. Mr. Obrador said he would be traveling to the Pacific Ocean archipelago of Islas Maria on Saturday and will be unable to take part, though Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard will represent him during the teleconference. Mr. Obrador, who has sought to remain neutral in the conflict, noted that Mexico had itself suffered invasion at the hands of Spain, France, and the United States. The Mexican leader said the United Nations didn't do its job well with regards to Ukraine, calling the war a failure of politics and urging dialogue. Let's talk to Dr. Michael Ogu, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the Babcock University. He joins us virtually. Good morning, Dr. Ogu. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, good morning, Ladi. Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start from the threats being issued to those who have chosen to remain neutral, shall we say, in this conflict. And the biggest of them all is China. The U.S. is saying that it could extend all the sanctions that have been placed on Russia right now to China if any evidence emerges that it is supporting Russia in any material way to continue with this conflict. Do you think that's something that is credible given China's size and the links between China and the Western world and how dependent they are on Chinese economic products?
Well, thank you so much for having me again. So, you know, this whole Russian invasion and the kickback that has come, you know, from it, from the West and other, you know, the various allies, has been something that has been very, very interesting. And not just in terms of the size of the economies that are involved, you know, but basically the size of the response that has been given to Ukraine, the response that has been provided for Ukraine, the support for Ukraine, you know, against Russia in this invasion. And that is something that no states, regardless of the size, regardless of the military size, the demographic size, the economic size, would want to dabble with. So of course, we know that China has a very large population. You know, it's very economically viable. But I'm sure that China wouldn't want to risk, you know, this size of sanctions in terms of the support that they provide for Russia in this invasion. And so states want to tread very cautiously. They want to be very careful, you know, so that they don't incur the wrath, basically, you know, of the West and Western allies in this messy situation. So I'm sure that China will also be very careful, you know, in providing whatever kind of support. If you remember, you know that China has been silent, but China was silent at the beginning of this invasion. There wasn't really any clear position that China was taking, you know, in terms of their response to the conflict or how they supported whether Ukraine or Russia. They were silent, you know, and that is strategic. And I'm sure that, you know, as much as they would want to support Russia, I don't think that they would want to push that lock too far.
Given that scenario, isn't there a bit of hypocrisy involved in all of this on all sides? We're talking, you're having people making statements at the UN and in other fora that there is need for peace and there is need to restore harmony and return to the negotiating table. Yet we're also hearing talks about assistance militarily to both sides. And there are those who have pointed out like the Mexican president, Obrador, that doing this makes peace talks even less likely. Because if both sides are receiving continuous infusion of arms and money to be able to make more purchases, progress on peace talks will be very, very minimal, if any.
Yeah. So the first thing we must understand is that, morality is not a question in international politics. So the issue of hypocrisy and morals and justice and all of these things, honesty, it is really a non-issue. International politics is about interests. It's about what drives those interests, and basically what helps to accomplish those interests. So while yes, there is need for peace talks, which now it's not even likely how much these peace talks can achieve. In terms of the ones that we have seen take place, especially the recent one in Turkey. And the outcomes. So there isn't so much that they are able to achieve at the moment. And perhaps that's because of also, how much military effort has gone into the exercise, as we speak. But yes, the truth is that, you cannot divorce diplomacy from military capabilities or military invasion, military, activities. There are two very potent instruments that states use in pursuit of their interests. And so when diplomacy fails, like it is now, it is very obvious that military might will come in. And there isn't the issue of morality, whether it is hypocritical or whether, states have an interest that they want to pursue at all costs.
I must then ask you about where this leaves us. 6 weeks on, there appears to be, even from the analysis you've just given, some stalemate building both on the diplomatic front and on the military front. It does appear as if Russia has not conquered Ukraine in the way that it expected at the start 6 weeks ago, but the Ukrainians have not pushed the Russians out of their country yet. So that's militarily. And then in terms of diplomacy, you've just described what the outcome of the Istanbul talks, which were the very latest, were. Who do you think is in a good position to push both sides to the negotiating table and end this? Who amongst all the players do you think would be well placed to do that at this point?
Well, that's a very tough question, and that's because we can see from all that has happened so far, and the countries that have tried to broker the peace, Israel, Turkey, and all these countries, we can see that despite how influential they are in terms of relating with the two parties involved, there hasn't been so much progress. So I think that the parties involved are the major actors in brokering the peace between them. So Russia, Ukraine, are, I think, the major actors that will help to bring about the peace, if at all there's going to be any semblance of that in the nearest future. Because if you look at the analysis of the talks that held in Istanbul, it is obvious that the offers, the terms, the conditions that are being provided now in terms of the peace agreement are all risky terms. So any option that is taken now comes with some level of risk for both Russia and Ukraine. And so I actually think that this conflict will continue for a very long time to come, because Russia is not ready yet to back out, because, like you said, they have not achieved their objective yet, and Ukraine also is not also willing to step down and compromise and accept any kind of, not very concrete agreements from Russia, because that would mean that they remain subject to Russian attacks in the future, or Russian invasion in the future. So this is a very decisive moment for both Ukraine and Russia. So I'm thinking that what might broker the peace in this case might be war weariness, when the two parties, have become weary from these military escapades, and then they can now come to the negotiating table and say, okay, this has not worked. Then how do we both make compromises, that we can both accept and move forward? But with the level of sanctions that are even coming from the Western countries and allies, I don't even see the roles that these countries can play in negotiating the peace now between these two parties, because Russia, would not see any of these allies as neutral parties to broker the peace. So it's a very tight situation, and I think that I think that the earlier these two parties come to a state where there's some level of war weariness, where they're tired of fighting, basically, perhaps because of the sanctions that have been imposed, because of the atrocities that Ukraine has suffered in terms of destruction of properties, deaths and killings and all of that, then perhaps they can come to negotiating table with compromises that can.
All right, then. Thank you very much, Dr. Ogu. Dr. Michael Ogu is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration in Babcock University. Thank you for your time and for your perspective this morning.
Thank you for having me here.
After the break, activists in Georgia lie down in front of Parliament to protest the Ukrainian war. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Dozens of people staged a lying down protest in Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, in 2 locations to condemn the events in the Ukrainian town of Bucha. Outside the parliament building, some had hands tied behind their backs. One person used a bicycle in a similar pose to a body seen in that town. Outside the Ukrainian embassy in the city, people left candles and flowers against a railing. The Georgian opposition politician Peter Siskarishvili says that he wants to show solidarity with Ukraine and those that had suffered in Bucha, adding that their government doesn't often express the sorrow and grief of the entire Georgian public. Meanwhile, several thousand Ukrainians and their supporters held a, quote, die-in protest outside the German parliament in Berlin to, in their words, visualize war and demand an immediate import embargo for Russian oil and gas. Many draped in Ukraine's national flag lay on the lawn in front of the Reichstag building, seat of the German Bundestag, or parliament, as an air-ticking sound was heard from loudspeakers. One of the organizers of the demonstration was political science lecturer at Kiev's School of Economics, Alexander Kudel, who is currently doing a postdoctorate research at Berlin's Free University. In reference to recent events in Bucha and Mariupol, Professor Kudel said, the world is watching, and with all the measures that have been taken so far, it's not enough. German Finance Minister Christian Lindner says Europe's biggest economy wants to stop imports of Russian oil and gas as soon as possible, but it was not feasible to do so immediately. About 250,000 Russian-born migrants and 150,000 people born in Ukraine live in Germany, and that was before President Putin ordered Russian troops into Ukraine on February 24th, which has prompted more than 300,000 Ukrainians to flee to Germany. All right, let's talk to global security analyst Dixon Osage, who joins me here in the studio. Good morning, Dixon. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much, Ladi. Good morning.
I'm going to start with the same question I asked my previous guest, Dr. Ogu, which had to do with the fact that so many of those who are in a position to help end this conflict are receiving threats from both sides. As part of our bulletin this morning, the Chinese were being told by the West that if they offered any material help to Russia, they would be the target of all these sanctions. And the question I asked is, do you think that that's something the Chinese would take seriously, considering that China is in Russia?
Well, I think they're going to take it very seriously because the way the war is going, first of all, Putin underestimated the resistance capability of the Ukrainian forces. If you go by the mechanical point of view, yes, the Russians are more equipped by the Ukrainian. Go by the people point of view, oh, yes, they have thousands of troops that the Ukrainians. But first of all, we must understand that the battle begins from the mind, you know. If once your mind is prepared, you go all out to engage your enemy because Putin is trading human lives for territorial gain. So if China feels like, or they want to support Russia in this unnecessary invasion of Ukraine, I think they are going to receive a global response.
That then brings me to what you talked about, the war being unnecessary.
Oh, yeah.
Russia seems to think that it's security. is being affected by having a neighbor, in this case, Ukraine, thinking about going into the EU, into NATO, and all of that, and that all attempts to make them seizing, quote and unquote, failed, and which was why it was doing this. On the other hand, Ukraine says it's a sovereign country and should be allowed to do whatever it pleases once that is in its interest.
All right.
The immovable force meeting the irresistible object. So, given that kind of situation, this is a fight to the death, it appears.
Oh, sure, yeah. Because what Putin is trying to do is that he's trying to gain more territory because he had already perceived the threat from the West as well. And he doesn't want Ukraine to be part of NATO and also having some United States military base that will pose threats within the Russian Confederation. So he tried to go all out to see if he could quickly invade Ukraine or achieve victory in respect of the forthcoming May 9 celebration. But so disappointing that he never achieved that victory because he underestimated the Ukrainian people, like I earlier said. So for me, I think Putin is ill-advised by his advisors, and they are afraid to tell him the truth because he actually thought that in getting to Ukraine, once the president flee, I think he's going to have an easy access. I'm so proud of the president of Ukraine because he was offered a ride and he said, no, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. If he had taken that ride, like I tell you for free, Ukraine, by now, I would not be talking about Ukraine. Maybe Putin would have succeeded in his ill activities. But the president stood by the people of Ukraine without experience. This is a president that does not have military experience, does not have a battlefield experience, but he stood by the people of Ukraine and said, I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. And the West and the Americans and other parts of the world began to supply him ammunition and also sanctioning Russia. The sanctioning of Russia, I'm seeing it as a long-time effect because it's not going to affect Russia at the moment. It's going to be a long-time effect because we're talking about human lives now. I would expect the Americans to do more to ensure that we don't lose more lives in Ukraine.
How do we then, the last point you made now, which is that even after we have said who is guilty and who is not and all of that, the overall objective should still be that the loss of lives, destruction of property and all that should stop.
Yeah, should be mitigated, yeah.
Now, how do we go about that? Some people have said, okay, first things first, Russia should withdraw from Ukraine. But even if the Russians withdrew from Ukraine, which I'm not saying they have said they will do, but if they do so, what is left behind in Ukraine now is a vast wasteland, a lot of destroyed infrastructure, a lot of deaths. Yeah. So that withdrawal is not going to by itself accomplish anything, is it?
Yeah, it's not going to accomplish much, but first of all, when you want to place priority in any given society, human lives come first. So we must place premium and priority on human life. So if peradventure Russia decides to take a withdrawal today, I think there will be mitigation in this area of human lives because Russia are losing more equipment by the day. When you go to a battlefield assessment and the loss assessment from a European assessment so far, I think Russia have lost about 17,000 lives, soldiers. Then going by their tanks, they've lost about 135 warplanes. They've lost a lot of thousands of war tanks, and that's why they want to call in for support from China and so on. But for me, if they take a withdrawal presently or right now, it's going to play a big role in Ukraine. I think most of these guys in Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, more than 4 million people have flee Ukraine as we speak. Yeah. And when you look at the ethnography of Ukraine, they only have about 44 million people in Ukraine. And when you look at the military size of Ukraine, apart from just reserves, which is about 900,000 troops, while they have about 300 to 500 active troops, you discover that Russia are more powerful. Yeah. But the support the Ukrainians are getting all over the world is very, very magnanimous. So for me, if Russia try or admits to take a withdrawal, it's going to be a relief to the world, and also economical-wise, psychological-wise, physiological-wise, the world will have a good breathing space.
Given that scenario, then, if Russia decides to take a withdrawal, as we've just posited now, all right. Would you say that as part of that, the Ukrainians also should also be placed under an embargo of arms to force them to consider peace?
Well, Eladi, you see, that's an intelligent question. You see, when Russia went to Crimea some few years ago, that's boosting the morale of the Ukrainian forces, and they trained over 200 to 300 soldiers, almost 700 soldiers on reserve, because they knew that there's an imminent threat, and they had expected this day to come, and they were prepared. But Russia thought that immediately they get to Ukraine, it will be an easy way. But thank God for Zelensky, because that's why we talk about leadership. Leadership is very, very essential in every day of time. If Zelensky had not stood his ground in the Ukrainian space, I tell you, Russia would have had its way. But for me, if there's going to be any form of a tactical withdrawal from Russia, there's no victor in this battle. There won't be any victor, because even if Russia withdraw or Ukrainian forces try to also, suppress the Russian invasion, there will be no victor, because a lot of lives have gone down. So for me, I will advise President Putin to fall back to his national security advisors to also re-strategize how they will allow Ukraine to live. Ukraine is a sovereign state. It's a democratical state. And when you go into history, Ukraine has been existing over 1,800 years ago. So they will
even before Russia.
Before Russia. So they will not put their future in the hands of Russia. The fight that is going on in Ukraine is a decider once and for all to forestall futuristic invasion by Russia.
Given that, my final question to you would, of course, be that, like in most conflicts, the African continent is a spectator in all of this.
Okay.
Even though we are bearing some of the consequences in the increased prices of goods and services, commodities, and all of that.
Okay.
Do you think there's a bit of a lesson in what is going on in Ukraine right now for African countries? Because it's not as if Africa
many lessons.
doesn't have its own conflicts too.
Many lessons. You see, when you look at the World War I, World War II, and what triggers World War II, you discover that it sprang up from the coalition. Now, if Americans have not applied a form of systematic and tactical approach, it would have escalated to World War III. What is happening in Ukraine could sprang up to World War III. But I thank God for West and other world leaders that are trying to, mitigate the situation so that it does not escalate. Now, going by your question, Ladi, I think it's the right time for us as a nation. Nigeria, let me talk about Nigeria, for example, to be very prepared. We've been battling with insurgents for over 12 years. I see that as a friendly match. What if we have a form of national attack or international battle, just like Russia and Ukraine? It's going to be a big one. So I will advise our government to see what is happening in Ukraine as an avenue for us to start developing our military capability, developing our air defense, developing our sea defense and our ground defense, so that we will not suffer from most of these unnecessary human beings that have taken the lives of Nigerians, like nothing. So for me, I think the war in Russia should be a stepping stone to every nation in Africa to be prepared for the wars, because the best time to prepare for war is peacetime. If you don't have good systematic approach, mechanical-wise, technological-wise, and physiological-wise to prepare in time of war, at peacetime, I think when wars spring up, you will be losing more men and you will have yourself to blame because you were never prepared.
That's a very good place to hang it, Dixon Osage. Thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you, Ladi.
Thank you
for all you do, Channels TV.
Thank you very much.
All right.
An international committee of the Red Cross team has led a convoy of buses and private cars carrying more than 1,000 people to Zaporizhzhia after the civilians fled the besieged Ukrainian town of Mariupol on their own. Speaking in a video provided by the organization, ICRC's Umar Nazim Khan had estimated the number of civilians to be more than 500, but in a later comment, not included in the footage, the figure was recalculated by Pascal Hunt, ICRC head of delegation in Ukraine. Nicole was one of those boarding the transport buses, standing with a woman and a young child. She said, "Our family let us go," with tears in their eyes, because this is a long journey and it is definitely dangerous. The ICRC has worked in Ukraine since 2014 and has recently brought over 700 tons of medical supplies, food and relief items into the country.
As you can see, we have made it to Zaporizhzhia with 7 autobuses and more than 500 civilians that were coming out of Mariupol, leading a safe passage out to Zaporizhzhia. We hope that we'll be back and continue to provide this safe passage to the civilians. And we have also observed acute humanitarian needs that we hope to respond as a neutral humanitarian intermediary and continue to help civilians.
The United States Senate will vote today to end normal trade relations with Russia and to ban the importation of oil. Both bills have been bogged down in the Senate. Its Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said he wished the vote could have happened sooner, but after weeks of talks with the other side, it's important that we have found a path forward. The trade suspension measure paves the way for U.S. President Joe Biden to enact higher tariffs on certain Russian imports. The bill banning Russian oil would codify restrictions Mr. Biden has already put in place through executive action. But meanwhile, Russia's finance ministry says it has paid rubles to foreign investors owed dollars after the United States banks couldn't process payments following changes to the Biden administration's policies. J.P. Morgan Chase & Co., the correspondent bank for two bonds Russia needed to service on Monday, declined to process $649.2 million in payments. The bank has previously been able to facilitate funds under a special exemption from the Treasury that let Russia use funds in U.S. banks solely for paying Western bondholders. The Biden administration revoked that policy this week, pitching Moscow closer to its first sovereign default in more than 2 decades. Big one there. Let's talk to Laddie Williams. Laddie, nice to have you with us.
Great to be here
to unpack this. The Russians carried out their threat since they weren't allowed access to the dollars.
Yes, as the U.S., and its allies, because at the end of the day, the U.S. is trying to, drain Russia of its U.S. currency in their reserves in Russia. So at this point, they're saying, you know what, we're not going to let you pay the bondholders with our banks, at this point. So what they're trying to do now is allow them to, sell their gold, their gold reserves, turn that into dollars, just try and drain them as much as possible. But Russia is not going to let that happen.
Allow anybody drain it.
Exactly. So they're saying, we're going to pay in rubles, and they have started making those payments. But the thing is, they have like a 30-day grace period, at this time. But it's a dollar-denominated bond, and the contract states dollars. So if they continue paying in rubles, it will be seen as a default, and it will be the first default since 1998. That was the last time Russia ever had, when they had their financial crisis at that point. And with what's going on now, if they are not able to, offset these bonds, in dollars, that's what's going to happen. So everyone is watching out for this 30-day grace period to see how it all plays out. But you never know. Maybe Putin might say, you know what, let's just pay from,
what we have with us.
Exactly.
Highly unlikely, though.
Highly unlikely.
The United Kingdom is freezing Sberbank's assets in a fresh round of Russian sanctions. So the Russian banks can step into this because they themselves are under sanctions.
Exactly. So Sberbank is the most important financial institution, for Russia, and they are quite, strategic, in the countries, because they employ, most of a high number of Russians in, back in Russia. So it's an old bank, and they reported about 25 trillion rubles in annual loans. It's quite big, and with this sanction is one of these financial sanctions. The U.S. is still trying to squeeze as much, out of Russia at this point. So targeting Sberbank at this point, that's the U.K., is in line with that move. They're not going to be able to use, their assets that are in UK at this point. So it's more sanctions, more financial sanctions, and obviously it's going to impact the operations of Sberbank at this point.
Now, when this war began in February, I remember the statement from U.S. President Joe Biden referring to the Russian national currency as ruble. And I think he meant that not in a complimentary way. But yes, it does appear, and I think Janet Yellen made reference to that the ruble has roared back.
Yes.
It recovered. Virtually everything is lost in the immediate aftermath of the war.
Exactly.
But the U.S. is tanking that by saying that Yes, that may be so on paper, but that in reality is a combination of things.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, these sanctions do have, an impact on the Russian economy. But, taking it back, we saw how the ruble, fell at that point. Fell about
at the point, I remember having a discussion with Ine here, and it was at that time 133 rubles, to a dollar.
To a dollar. Quite a dramatic drop there in value. But now we're seeing, it's clawed back all of that. It's now trading about 79 rubles to the dollars at yesterday. But all of this is because at the end of the day, the reliance on Russian gas is still heavy, and they're still buying Russian energy. So that's why you see Europe now looking for every opportunity now to be able to avoid Russian gas at this point, because at the end of the day, you're buying Russian gas, you're paying Russia, and Russia is already, we've seen that they're poised to make over $300 billion this year. That's the outlook, from their sale of energy. So at the end of the day, if it's not, if Europe is not able to actually wean off reliance on Russian energy, we're going to see them still making money. At the end of the day, they have to target energy.
Yes,
we've seen them
for it to have any kind of effect on the Russians.
We've seen them ban Russian coal, but Russian coal is not that.
It's not that. And the markets are rattled by all of this.
Oh yes, the markets are rattled because at the end of the day, this is all stoking inflation, and we've seen central bankers all around the world, fighting inflation at this point. And it's all about the rates at this point. Traders are looking at the body language of the Fed, and they're seeing that, more aggressive rates are coming. So they're trying to hedge, against inflation at this point. And obviously risk assets, you don't want to be in risk assets, at this point. It's quite volatile. We've seen Europe, the FTSE drop about 0.53%. Asia, Nikkei 225, that one's dropped. US, all the markets are rattled. Plus NASDAQ, the tech-heavy NASDAQ, that dropped about 2%. And we've seen the relationship between, the crypto market and the NASDAQ. We've seen Bitcoin tumble from about $47,000. It's now trading at $43,000. So we're seeing risk-offs at this point. Traders are rattled. Not easy being an investor
at this point.
At this point, But we're seeing oil actually recover, some gains this morning.
Indeed, Ladi. Details of that, of course, will be on Business Morning and with Ladi later on Business Incorporated. So you join Ladi and Ini for that on Business. They'll still unpack all of this for you. Thank you, Ladi, for your time. We're going on a short break. When we return, Russian and Belarusian sportsmen and women will not be allowed to participate in the Boston Marathon this year. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has imperiled global food security, creating suffering within Ukraine and displacing millions while disrupting agricultural production and trade from one of the world's major exporting regions. The United States Agency for International Development's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security says it has seen price increases, but looking at supply, stocks, particularly for staples. This and more from the discuss of the consequences of the war in Ukraine on food security, organized by the U.S. Department of State's Africa Regional Media Hub.
Africa Regional Media Hub.
It's a digital press briefing on the impact of the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine, its impact on food security in Africa and around the world, organized by the Africa Regional Media Hub. Featured speakers are Ambassador Cindy McCain, the permanent representative of the U.S. mission to the UN agencies in Rome, and Dr. Jim Banhart, assistant to the administrator and the U.S. Agency for International Development's USAID's Bureau for Resilience and Food Security, and other journalists. According to the United Nations, 40% of wheat and corn exports from Ukraine go to the Middle East and Africa. Ukraine itself was a major source of wheat for the World Food Programme, with the WFP feeding 138 million people in more than 80 countries, including Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Nigeria. The Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that as many as 13 million more people worldwide will be pushed into food insecurity as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Ambassador Cindy McCain, the permanent representative to the U.S. mission to the United Nations agencies in Rome, says the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought food security in the global spotlight, skyrocketing food and fertilizer prices, and critical grain shortages in some of the poorest countries.
As long as Russia continues this brutal campaign, innocent people are going to pay the price. I was recently in Kenya and Madagascar and saw firsthand some extremely vulnerable communities that will suffer even more because of Putin's war. As Assistant Administrator Jim Barnett will tell you, the United States is very focused on mitigating the effects of this conflict and other shocks to the food system. As a government, we've invested heavily in resilience building programs and committed to providing more than $11 billion over the next 5 years to address food security and nutrition needs worldwide. But Russia alone can stop this global catastrophe we're facing and also being felt on the African continent and beyond.
For the assistant to the administrator and the Bureau of Resilience and Food Security, before Russia invaded Ukraine, the food security context was already concerning due to the lasting COVID-19 impact, ongoing humanitarian emergencies, and high global food prices, among others.
And from the last global food crisis in 2007 and 2008, we saw the destabilizing effect this can have on international order. During that time, food riots occurred in at least 14 African countries. And even with the release of grain reserves or the cessation of hostilities, the impacts will persist. There will be irreversible effects on food production as farmers lack the resources and inputs to plant their spring and summer crops. But there's much that we can do. Following the food price spikes in 2008, President Obama launched the U.S. government's Feed the Future initiative, and it brought American ingenuity to bear to invest long-term in sustainable food systems. And Feed the Future and its partners are working to strengthen resilience, food systems, agriculture investments, and improve nutrition, which are foundational to our long-term goal of improving household well-being.
While addressing specifically a question on Nigeria and how the U.S. is going to help those countries that already were experiencing some issues with food insecurity, Dr. Banhart had this to say.
The idea of promoting local investments in agriculture products, I think is a good one, and I think we can have debates about the policy measures that are the best way to do that. Nigeria has chosen to do what's called a import substitution model, where they ban imports and products to promote that. We can discuss that. I think the bottom line is that if the Nigeria smallholder farmer is able to improve their quality of life, then that would be something we'd want to talk further about. But it's an interesting idea.
The meeting ended with hopes that there can be strengthening of policies that support open trade and robust food systems for the continent and the rest of the world. Millicent Walker, Channels Television News.
Russian and Belarusian runners will not be allowed to take part in this year's Boston Marathon because of the invasion of Ukraine. The Boston Athletic Association says Russian and Belarusian athletes living in their respective countries are barred from the April the 18th race. However, Russian and Belarusian citizens not residing in either country will be allowed to take part, but not under the flag of either nation. The Boston Marathon, one of the world's major marathons, is returning to its traditional April slot this year after disruption caused by the pandemic. And the All England Tennis Club is likely to ban Russian players who do not publicly speak out against Russian President Vladimir Putin and the country's invasion of Ukraine from this year's Wimbledon tournament. UK Sports Minister Nigel Huddleston says Daniil Medvedev and other Russians must provide assurance in a written declaration that they are not receiving money from Mr. Putin, Russia, or Belarus, and that they will not be making supportive comments of Mr. Putin, Russia, or Belarus. Since the All England Tennis Club has an independent tournament status, it could ban Russian and Belarusian athletes without facing any legal consequences. Russian and Belarusian athletes have currently been able to compete in ATP, WTA, and ITF events playing under a neutral flag. And finally, a Chicago-based volunteer-led not-for-profit body has organized evacuations for over 15,000 people from war-torn Ukraine since February the 25th, 2022. Ukraine Trust Chain funds teams on the grounds in war-zone cities that evacuate women, children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities from the front lines of the invasion. Since late February, Chekeski who was born and raised in Kiev but moved to Chicago in Illinois, has been organizing this event. In spite of the long hours he's logging, Mr. Chekeski cedes the credit to the volunteer teams that are working with him in Ukraine itself. In addition to evacuations, Ukraine Trust Change collects and distributes food and other basic needs to approximately 35 to 50,000 Ukrainians each week. All right, that's how we end our program this morning. Thanks for being with us. My name is Ladi Akere-Dulwale. There's an update at 5 o'clock, and the show is back tomorrow at 9. Do have a pleasant Thursday ahead.